Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this week feels a little bit odd. A lot of it's getting overshadowed by a massive release that I'll probably have to cover solo at some point. But even then, it feels like we're speeding towards a year end that might actually wind up a bit quieter than I was expecting. Now, I'm not complaining. It'll allow me to empty out my own personal backlog. But before we get there, let's get on the pulse. Now, before we go any further, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. We're still rebuilding the channel here, but we have 6 projects on the docket here. Let's first go back and talk about From Brandi Carlile in These Silent Days.
Only broken horses know to run.
Well, this one's long overdue. I knew I would have to make the time to do the full deep dive on Brandi Carlile's hefty back catalog the first time I heard her contributions on the Highwomen, especially given how much critical acclaim and respect that she had accumulated in the meantime, both within and without of country. And now having done so, well, I'll say this, she didn't quite click immediately for me, as I think it took until 2009's Give Up the Ghost that she sounded like she had grown into her uniquely powerful voice and finally got some production that could flatter her, and yet from there, well, the best way to describe the projects that follow, even as the writing and vocals got consistently stronger, the production remained kind of a product of its time. Bear Creek is very reminiscent of an early 2010s folk project. The Firewatcher's Daughter sounds imported from mid-2010s indie rock, especially in the guitars and the egregious vocal mixing. And by the way, I Forgive You, it has her with Dave Cobb, and it feels like a bit of a culmination across the board, easily leading into the Highwomen, and it's one of her best. Now this time around, honestly a bit tricky to contextualize. Again, working with Dave Cobb, but with Shooter Jennings co-producing, it's an album that is taking stock of the world, with multiple songs attempting to impart advice to her children, but also grappling with people that she's close to that are making bad decisions, or being a lot more fallible than she would want to admit. And that includes herself, where for as much as she wants to embody a more maternal figure, she's acutely aware that she could be a mama wolf that has some fangs. Hell, there's a song here called Mama Werewolf that literally plays into some of that rather tempestuous territory. And that contributes to the balancing act of this album. Half tender, soft-spoken moments that can lead to a few absolute tearjerkers, but can also run on the tepid side for a song or two, but also half the songs picking up some more rollicking intensity or raw fury, where Brandi Carlile's incredible firepower of a voice can really come to bear, but how well she's supported by the mix can feel a little bit inconsistent. Although there is something almost borderline prog to some of the melodies and percussion arrangements on Broken Horses that really surprised me and kind of reminded me of what Jason Isbell did on Reunions last year. That's a positive. But in fact, there is a tonal inconsistency with this album, because while she'll hit a lot of peaks on both sides of that balance, they are peaks that can overshadow an album that can't quite consistently land that gut punch. Now, to be fair, she hits those high points so effectively that it's kind of hard to complain, and I'm not sure there's really a bad song here. The album opens off really strongly with the ballad Right on Time. Broken Horses and Mama Werewolf unsurprisingly kick a lot of ass. When You're Wrong is absolutely devastating as a ballad, and the 1-2 punch of the story calling out American Christian hypocrisy about immigration on Sinners, Saints, and Fools, along with some of Cobb's best in the industry strings production, balanced out with the very tired, mature heartbreak of throwing good after bad, it might be one of the best closers on any album I've heard this year, but I don't know, I'm just not sure there's enough meat to the other songs to flesh this out, especially as the album feels weirdly short at only 10 songs and under 40 minutes. That being said, while I'm not sure this is her best, the best moments of this project yank it up to a light 8 out of 10, if only because Brandi Carlile is insanely talented, and enough songs are either pulse-pounding or legit tearjerkers, one or the other. Respect where it's due, I'm glad now that I'm just properly on board. Next up from Snail Mail, Valentine. Am I the only one who feels like we're getting another one of those vaguely 90s inspired indie rock acts where the majority of the appeal is locked into a pretty rote formula with rarely enough tunes, writing, or punch to rise above. Like, I listened to her 2018 debut, which I remember getting some hype, and it was fine, pretty well produced, decently performed for what it was, but there was very little that really stood out for me. And while there might be a little bit more to this one, I'm sorry, I'm still not all that impressed. Part of this is frontwoman Lindsay Jordan's voice, a flattened, not particularly strong, husky tone that audibly cracks all across this album but doesn't really contribute to her power, and it certainly's got texture and expressiveness but can lack a greater sense of control, which I guess might fit with the intended flawed romanticism of the album, but occasionally hits weird timbres for me. It ties into the tension at the core of the album between how all-encompassing the feelings of love can be versus the reality that can come with buying in that much, not just putting a partner on a pedestal, but also relationships that might run their course, or just the reality of the passion really cooling off. But I gotta say it's not really a tension that I feel materializes all that well. Part of this is the poetry from Jordan that can feel pretty bare bones and direct, but it also doesn't really lean into any of the giddiness or pleasure that could come from those romantic moments. The love connection feels draining across the board, and on a few cuts, oddly sour in its compulsion. And while that might be the reality of the situation, it's not really one that's got much larger appeal for me, unless you're a sub who is really into that emotionally engulfing feeling that in its own way feels kind of undercut by all the self-aware commentary on it. Granted, the production and the instrumentation really doesn't help here, with a bit more orchestrated gloss with some strings and some slightly brighter guitars, along with some oily synths that really don't add any sparkle to the title track or Forever Sailing, but minus any propulsive grooves with any sort of fluid definition. On cuts like Ben Franklin, they feel really blocky. Madonna winds up considerably stronger in contrast just by having a little bit more rollick, or a lot of really potent hooks, because I'm not really wowed here. A lot of these compositions default to a very 90s, early 2000s brand of indie pop rock that, to be frank, can't match anything that Charlie Adams did in similar territory with Bullseye earlier this year. It's not the fault of Snail Mail. I blame the larger critical establishment that can overhype the hell out of projects like this, seemingly without digging that much deeper, but I also know how part of this is how my own emotional dynamics with relationships might be in slightly different territory, so I'm just more lukewarm than outright negative on this. 6 out of 10, it's got its moments. I'm not coming back to it. Next up from IDLES, Crawler.
The silence ringing for days.
At some point in the past 2 years, the discourse around IDLES got completely stupid. I want to say it was last year around Ultra Mono, where a combination of questionable scene backlash, some really disingenuous criticism, and an unfortunately weaker album left the band in an oddly exposed place, where they only seemed to be getting more popular, but the writing was losing the pathos for this weird sourness, and the grooves were feeling stiffer at every step, and you could tell that the band seemed to be in a really uncertain spot. It gave me the feeling that Crawler was either going to be a complete return to form or just go completely off the rails, let the band showcase more dimensionality and flair for better and worse. So why am I left with the feeling that this album is both less fun and less interesting than it really should be? Let's get this out of the way now. This is probably IDLES' most diverse project in terms of tones, and frontman Joe Talbot trying to sing a lot more, with a mix that feels more expansive and searching, and that's a really nice way of me saying that this is going right down to the by-the-numbers retro post-punk rabbit hole when it comes to faded, grayscale progressions with a lot of ugly tones and more texture than melody, because the band is trying to take themselves way more seriously and overcorrect from everyone calling their lyrics near parody on Ultra Mono. And I think that kind of missed the point of a lot of those criticisms, even if I don't entirely agree. It wasn't that the band was funny or incapable of taking on serious subject matter, as their worst critics often conveniently ignored. It was that the social commentary interwoven with the humor felt increasingly shallow as the albums went on. It went broad, playing for mass appeal at the expense of the smarter and more detailed barbs. And going for more serious with blunt lyricism gives you a much narrower margin for error, almost going back to some of the weaker songs on Brutalism, but also going for slower tempos, more faded production, weaker hooks, pushing Talbot deeper into the mix on a longer album with the seriousness and the sourness way more at the forefront and way more reliance on heavy percussion, where all the consequences of their reckless abandon are now hitting them in the face. I gotta say it, the balance is just completely off here. Even if there are some moments where the guitars and bass lines embrace some clanking, distorted noise rock sizzle, and their knack for heaviness and groove, it can be as potent as ever. The DNA, the creative DNA I like about this band is still here. And look, I'm not denying that there's something therapeutic about an album like this, where you're confronted with the cycles of addiction and vice and you gotta crawl out of it. Probably all the more harrowing coming from an act like IDLES, and the moments where they can accept that their fragile humanity are the most potent here in terms of triumphant energy, with a pretty solid ending that actually makes up for a lot. But part of this has me feeling that IDLES just are not playing to their own strengths, and if anything, are playing against them, especially when there's nothing close to even a model village here in terms of hooks. There's something very cruelly ironic on an album confronting its protagonists where the band's limitations are all the more sharply defined. I mean, I just wish it was better. 6 out of 10. This was a disappointment. Next up from Aesop Rock and Blockhead, Garbology.
I'm a lighthouse in a blunt smoke. Dear motherfuckers, I'm teetering if you must know. Wolf at the door like a bug to the fructose. Niece on the phone saying Ian, you should visit more. We could build forts what a pig's court civil war.
This might surprise you. I was a lot more worried about this album than you might expect. Not because Aesop Rock can't crank out consistent quality or that Blockhead wouldn't work for him, they've been collaborating for decades, but because I've seen a lot of underground MCs on the more conspiratorial fringe fall into some nasty shit during the past 2 years of quarantine, and given that one of them, Homeboy Sandman, is on the album, I was kind of concerned what could potentially happen with this, but thankfully my concerns were put to rest because Garbology feels a lot more like a slightly more streamlined and kind of twisted follow-up on Spirit World Field Guide than falling down any sort of internet rabbit hole of bullshit, mostly because Aesop Rock seems generally distrustful of the internet as he continues to become more of the underground's wizened archmage hermit amidst all the ruins. Now, when I reviewed his last project, I highlighted just how well equipped Aesop Rock's music and also quasi-paranoid observational musings were for that time, but for a project that was actually written within the throes of the pandemic and lockdown, this one feels both darker, but also more immediate, where it makes way too much sense for Billy Woods to come on and contribute some backing vocals, and once again, there's a lot of focus on the abandoned, decaying world in its midst, all the detritus, digging through all the trash to see what could also be salvaged going forward. And while Aesop Rock remains top of his class in presenting all this sense of detail, and Blockhead's production is appropriately hardscrabble in the percussion and the warped balance of glittering synth and rougher organic samples, while actually featuring some better vocal blending than Aesop Rock's own production, I am left kind of feeling that this does feel a bit like familiar territory for everyone involved here. I mean, come on, Aesop Rock's been building on this subject matter for a couple of years and projects now, especially in the face of all the unknowns to come. And while I appreciate that he himself saying that it's often a lot less deep than it seems, as well as bringing more immediacy, I do wish there was a little bit more personal detail, like the best moments from The Impossible Kid, or a greater sense of storytelling or narrative to add a little bit more structure to the wordplay, paint more of the world, where the best example here being the short conversations about death on All the Smartest People, or the consumptive ooze that he almost seems to become on Oh Fudge. I mean, I gotta say, the guy's got a great sense of humor, I will give him that. I will say that the darker tone overall does give the weirdness a bit more of a pensive vibe. Aesop Rock is very conscious of how this strange decay can can become normalized, and what that can do to all the psyches of ordinary people, especially with a slightly more aggressive police force cracking down on those who are looking to discover more and seek some change, maybe get away from this system. And even if the album has some pretty solid hooks overall, with Difficult being one of his best in recent memory, I don't know, it might wind up as a bit of a tougher listen, not quite having that same sense of wonder that you got on Spirit World Field Guide. That being said, it's really hard for me to not enjoy Untangling, an Aesop Rock album, and while it's not his best, I did enjoy this a lot. Light 8 out of 10, again, not his best, definitely worth hearing though. Next up from Walk the Moon, Heights.
Then close your eyes, roll the dice, take a chance with my love.
So it's been 4 years since the last Walk the Moon album, and I'm not going to say that their brand of indie rock has fallen out of favor or lost the luster beyond the retro style getting driven into the ground by so many festival acts who are looking for that cash in. But look, even back when I reviewed Talking Is Hard in 2014, while I appreciated their willingness to experiment within genres with a lot of colorful textures and a few legit great hooks, there was just this weird hollowness to their approach where their influences were just so obvious and their writing never amounted to a lot more, only reinforced further on What If Nothing in 2017. I found myself wondering if this band just got more credit than they deserve because Shut Up and Dance felt so much bigger than the slew of other forgettable indie commercial core that would really follow it from this act. But then I actually took a different tactic with this. I mean, call it playing to a lower standard, but maybe it just made a little bit more sense to treat Walk the Moon more like a splashy, fun pop act that isn't trying to make deeper statements. More style than substance, sure, but that can work in this lane. You can have fun with it. And thus with this album, okay, look, I might have already spoiled some of this in a recent episode of Rock Coliseum, but I gotta call it like I see it. This album is split between some of the most shameless 80s pop rock pandering I have heard in recent memory. I mean, come on, Fire in Your House feels like a blatant riff on Wanna Be Startin' Something by Michael Jackson. What You Can't Look Up is an obvious U2 pastiche, and Someone Else's Game has a real heart rock tinged rollick that would have been pulled straight from the late 80s or very early 90s with splashes of Americana. I mean, the Killers have been riding this territory a lot in recent memory. But then Walk the Moon's also flagrantly ripping off the 1975 on cuts like Giants, Don't Make Me, and then maybe Bleachers for good measure with Population of Two. And yet I kind of had fun with it. It goes back to what I said about Ed Sheeran a couple weeks ago. When you're calling back to retro sounds with a lot of color and flair, and it can embrace many of the melodic subtleties pretty well, it becomes hard for me to complain, especially when there are songs on this project that try to go for an overblown, percussion-heavy indie pop sound that owes a lot more to the modern mainstream, and they're performed with nowhere close to the same enthusiasm or flair. They just go in one ear and out the other. And given that Walk the Moon still are not lyrical, I can argue that going for lower stakes with the careening, reckless love songs and breakup songs might be a better fit than a lot of the 1975's overreaches on their last two albums. Now, all that being said, Nicholas Petrika is still a pretty anonymous singer. With a lot of thin lyrics, this album kind of lives and dies on how good the hooks are, and that can be kind of spotty on a project that's a few songs too long. But even though the album is kind of disposable, again, I had a decent bit of fun with this. So solid 6 out of 10. Not sure how long it's gonna stick, but not half bad either. And finally, from Summer Walker, Still Over It.
Just rest, guaranteed to beat your ass. That'll be your ways for a reason now. Too much for to take. Follow what she gotta say. No.
So she got nearly the entire damn album to chart. Might as well talk about it here, it's gonna get traffic. Full disclosure, I'm not a Summer Walker fan. I heard both of her albums and found myself utterly unimpressed across the board, but I do get why she's popular. Jhené Aiko's vibe leans on a lot more provocative and deep and mature topics. SZA doesn't release consistently enough. Her hasn't quite had the consistent breakthrough she really needs, and that's to say nothing of Ari Lennox and Snow Allegra. So Summer Walker playing to the lowest common denominator of this slow burn, moody, husky R&B, it makes a lot of sense, especially as she's willing to actually write more hooks, and that'll pull in a pop audience. But that's about the most I will give her, because while this might be a little bit more refined, it's still very much a Summer Walker album with many of the flaws carrying from Over It. For one, I'm just not a fan of her as a singer. She conveys shockingly little organic presence and is really dependent on the auto-tune and her multi-tracking, and thus placing her on the same tracks as SZA and Ari Lennox was a big mistake. But this time it's just also very obvious that she's trying to pull from Jhené Aiko's playbook with a lot more acoustic instrumentation and some subtler percussion, and look, no, I'm sorry, she's not remotely in the same ballpark. This is not living up to a Chilombo or a Sold Out. I think a big part of this is that her production is caught between the more ethereal, acoustic-leaning sound and a much more conventional R&B sound with a lot of stiffer drum machines, heavier bass, and a much more obvious influence from the 90s and 2000s. Which, again, part of her appeal. I get why folks would like this, but the production quality in terms of mixing and mastering is nowhere near as smooth or liquid to make it work. The progression sounds really inconsistent, the grooves often run into a slog thanks to some surprisingly sloppy pacing, and especially the vocal mix sounds really rough, a lot less consistent and weirdly cheaper in ways that it shouldn't be. But my big issue's in the content. You know what's funny? For as much as Jhené's been caricatured by some as making messy music for girls who get high in their cars, there's a standard to doing that well, and Jhené can convey a level of introspection, maturity, spirituality, and emotional depth that Summer Walker just cannot approach in terms of themes or poetry. I mean, you can call it pretentious. I would disagree, but I get where it's coming from. But I'd take that over Summer Walker's capricious but really inconsistent back and forth over her relationship with her producer, co-writer, and now ex-boyfriend, London On Da Track. And if there was infidelity involved or some awkward double standards or miscommunications, I get how that might be difficult to untangle and how that would make some emotional quandaries. But when the poetry feels as blunt as it is, you don't really open up many lanes for subtlety and nuance. And Summer Walker herself is less trustworthy as a focal point amidst this mess. There are moments within a song where she'll be acknowledging that it didn't work or there were failures on both sides and she wants to move on, but then she'll throw out a stream of accusations that make you wonder what the hell she even wants beyond controlling the ever-shifting narrative. And that might be fine for a wallowing project like this where being capricious and lightly manipulative is part of the appeal, but it's not framed to do anything more than that, let alone honestly critique what that might mean for her and her relationships. At least 2088 tried to show more of both sides, and it becomes exhausting and melodramatic on a bloated album, but with the basic poetry and derivative delivery and presentation, just can't make the most of it. That being said, I get why this album will work for its target audience, which is absolutely not me, but I've also heard better in this lane, and even if Summer Walker isn't over it, I sure as hell am. 5 out of 10. Take it or leave it. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. I'll say it again. I can imagine I may have said some controversial things at some point in the video. Comments are down there. Have fun. But beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears from you. And if you guys want to get involved in getting albums on my schedule before the end of the year, you're running out of time for that. But hey, if you want to get involved, potentially talk with me on my Discord, anything else, link to my Patreon is right over there. Do not feel obligated to join or anything. It's tough times. I understand. I'll be fine, but options available. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.